Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. On the night I turned 70, I should have been celebrating with my family. Instead, my daughter-in-law planted drugs under my pillow, the police dragged me out in handcuffs, and my own son just stood there silent. In that moment, I realized I was no longer his mother, but their target. They thought they could erase me, steal the $12.5 million legacy I had spent a lifetime building. But they forgot one thing. A woman who spent her life with nothing does not surrender it so easily. I woke that morning with a heaviness in my chest, and a strange determination in my hands. 70 years old, I told myself, and I was still fussing over the fold of napkins and the shine of silverware. I set the table in my dining room in Richmond with the same care I once put into lesson plans. Every plate straight, every fork lined up, candles waiting to be lit when the sun went down. I wanted it to be warm, a reminder to my family of who I was, of the home I had built. The smell of roast chicken filled the air, rosemary and garlic seeping into every corner of the house. It reminded me of Sundays when Zach was little, when he used to sit at the kitchen counter swinging his legs and sneaking pieces of bread before dinner. I let that memory settle in my chest as I moved around the kitchen, even though it already felt too far away. Brooke arrived before the guests, dressed in cream silk and heels that clicked against the hardwood. She swept in like a hostess at a gala, moving vases, correcting the way I had placed the forks. She lifted the lid off the potatoes I had mashed and announced that they were too thick, maybe she should fix them. Her tone was sweet but sharp. I kept my mouth closed. I had learned that arguing only gave her another stage to perform on. Zach came down a little later, his phone in hand, his face expressionless. He nodded to Brooke, not to me, and slid into the chair at the end of the table as though it was his rightful place. My heart ached at the sight. He had once been a boy who clung to me, who wanted me to watch every little thing he did. Now he was a man who sat in my house and looked right past me. I lit the candles early, hoping the soft glow would calm the tension in my chest. The doorbell rang just as I was placing the last serving spoon. I started toward the foyer, but Brooke's heels beat me there. I heard the door open, then the sound of two male voices, steady and clipped. I froze. Two uniformed officers stepped inside. They asked for me by name, their faces blank with duty. For a moment, I thought it had to be some mistake. Maybe a car broken into down the street, maybe some paperwork error. My mouth opened, but no sound came. Brooke pressed her hand to her chest with a sharp intake of breath. She looked from the officers to Zach with wide eyes, the picture of shock. Zach did not move. He did not even put down his phone. The taller officer explained that they had a warrant to search my bedroom. My stomach dropped. I tried to speak, to ask why, but the words dissolved in my throat. I stepped aside because I did not know what else to do. Their boots thudded against the stairs. I followed, numb, as if I was sleepwalking through a dream I could not wake from. In my room, the lamp glowed softly just as I had left it. One of the officers pulled back the pillow I had smoothed earlier that day. Beneath it, a clear plastic bag caught the light. White crystals gleamed inside it. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had never seen it before. Brooke let out another gasp behind me, her hand flying to her mouth with perfect timing. She whispered something about how terrible it looked, how she never imagined. Her eyes darted once toward Zach, quick and sharp. I looked at my son, desperate for him to say something, anything to stand up to defend me. But he stared straight ahead, jaw locked, his face unreadable. No flicker of disbelief, no question for the officers, not even a glance at me. The older officer lifted the bag, nodded to his partner, and then I felt cold steel clamp around my wrists. My arms were pulled behind me, the metal bit into my skin. I swallowed a cry, but the shame pressed harder than the cuffs. They guided me down the stairs. The candles still burned on the table. The chicken still steamed. The glasses I had polished glistened under the light as though nothing had happened. Except everything had. Brooke stood at the bottom of the stairs, lips pressed tight in a line that could be mistaken for pity by anyone who did not know her. I knew better. I had seen that satisfaction in her eyes before. Zach sat at the table, unmoving, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. He did not rise, did not question, did not even look at me as they pulled me toward the door. Outside, the night was cool, and the air smelled faintly of rain. The street was quiet, but I felt the eyes of neighbors behind curtains. I stumbled as they led me down the steps, the heels of my shoes scraping the concrete. The squad car waited its lights, casting red and blue shadows across the lawn. They opened the back door and pressed me inside. The seat was stiff, the air thick with leather and disinfectant. The door shut with a heavy thud that echoed inside me. Through the window I saw my house one last time. The curtains glowing with warm light, the roses I had planted years ago brushing against the glass. Brooke lingered in the doorway framed by my home's light, as if she belonged there more than I ever had. Zach's silhouette sat at the table, still as stone. The car pulled away. The candles flickered smaller in the distance until they disappeared. I sat with my wrists aching, my heart heavier than I thought possible. That was the moment I stopped lying to myself. On my 70th birthday, the day that should have been filled with family and gratitude, I saw the truth with painful clarity. I was no longer a mother in their eyes. I was a target. The squad car carried me through the streets of Richmond, past familiar corners and storefronts that blurred into streaks of light. My hands ached from the cuffs, my throat raw from silence. I did not trust myself to break. When the station doors shut behind me, I stepped into a place that felt colder than the night outside. The fluorescent lights buzzed, casting everything in harsh, unforgiving glare. They took my fingerprints, pressed each finger down until the ink smudged my skin. They photographed me against a blank wall, the camera flashing like lightning. Then the charges were spoken. Possession with intent. The words felt foreign, absurd, like they belonged to someone else. My voice cracked as I whispered that it was not mine, that I had never seen it before, but no one listened. A female officer read from a folder, her tone flat, rehearsed. A written statement had been submitted weeks earlier by Brooke Hayes. She had claimed her mother-in-law had become paranoid, unstable, possibly using substances. I could almost hear Brooke's voice shaping those words, careful, practiced. My stomach turned at the realization that this was planned long before tonight. They led me down a hallway that smelled of bleach and damp concrete. The metal door clanged shut behind me as I entered a cell barely wider than my dining room table. A narrow cot sagged in the corner, covered by a thin gray blanket. The toilet sat exposed in the corner, no privacy, no dignity. I lowered myself onto the cot, my body stiff, my heart pounding. The silence pressed against me like another set of bars. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed, then footsteps faded. I was alone. That first night stretched endlessly. The blanket did little against the chill, and the hum of the overhead light drilled into my head. I thought of the table still set back at home, candles flickering out one by one until nothing remained. I wondered if Brooke had blown them out herself, claiming the house as hers now. I wondered if Zach had even stayed in the room after I was dragged away. I pressed my hands together, staring at the faint red marks left by the cuffs. I thought of every year I had worked, every dollar I had saved, every sacrifice I had made. All of it could vanish with a few papers signed with a story carefully crafted by people who should have loved me. When dawn broke, a guard slid a tray through the slot. Powdered eggs and burnt toast sat cooling on the metal plate. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to eat. I knew I would need strength not for the food itself, but for what lay ahead. I asked if I could make a call. The guard nodded and handed me a phone down the hall. I dialed Zach's number with shaking fingers. The ring felt endless. Finally, his voice answered, low tired. He did not ask if I was all right. He only said the lawyers would handle it and that I should cooperate. Then he hung up. The silence on the line afterward was louder than anything I had heard in that cell. My son had chosen. He had chosen her. I returned to the cot, each step heavier than the last. My chest burned with something beyond grief, something harder and sharper. For hours I sat with my back against the wall, staring at nothing, my mind racing with images of Brooke writing her statement, rehearsing her gasps of shock, smiling quietly as she signed the papers that painted me as unstable. The second night was worse. The cold seeped into my bones, and the concrete floor pressed its chill through the thin soles of my shoes. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Zach's face expressionless, refusing to meet my gaze. At one point, I heard laughter from down the corridor, other inmates talking in low voices. Their sounds reminded me that life went on even in places like this. But my life outside was being dismantled piece by piece, and I could do nothing but sit in silence. I thought of my roses back home, of the garden I had tended each season. I wondered if Brooke would let them wither, or worse, claim them as her own. The thought burned more than the cold. Somewhere deep in the night, I whispered to myself words no one else would hear. They want me gone. They want my life. But I will not give it. I will not go quietly. When morning came again, pale light spilling through the small barred window, I felt something inside me harden. I had spent 2 nights on a cot meant to break me. I had listened to the silence of a son who had turned his back. But I was not finished. I straightened my spine, pushed the blanket aside, and stood with steady feet. They might think they had written the end of my story, but they were wrong. I promised myself that I would not lose everything I had built. I would not surrender my name, my home, or the fortune of a lifetime to their greed. If they wanted a fight, they had just found one. The bus ride back into Richmond felt longer than the 2 nights I had just spent in that cell. I sat by the window with a small plastic bag on my lap that held my wallet, my glasses, and the keys they had returned to me. The driver glanced at me in the mirror once or twice, but said nothing. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered. My hair matted my face, lined deeper with weariness. I pressed my lips together to keep them from trembling. When the bus stopped at the corner near my street, I stepped down slowly, my knees stiff, my shoulders aching. The familiar row of houses stretched before me, porches with rocking chairs, tidy lawns that neighbors took pride in. Everything looked the same, but I knew it was not. My house waited at the end. Its shutters painted the pale blue I had chosen myself years ago, but as I approached it no longer felt like mine. The front door was unlocked. I turned the knob and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something sweet maybe Brooke had baked. My eyes swept across the living room. The furniture was neatly arranged cushions perfectly placed, almost too perfect, as though someone had staged the room for visitors. My steps echoed strangely on the hardwood. Zach appeared in the hallway, his shirt untucked, his face calm in a way that made my stomach twist. He did not ask how I was. He simply said that the charges had been dropped for now, but I needed to be more careful in the future. Then he held out a folder of papers thick with documents I did not recognize. My voice cracked when I asked what they were. He explained, his tone measured and flat, that they were financial authorizations, medical directives, and other forms meant to protect me in case something like this ever happened again. Brooke entered just then, her hair pulled back neatly, a bright smile fixed on her face. She carried a plate of cookies and set them on the coffee table as though we were simply enjoying a Sunday afternoon. She told me it was all just to keep me safe, to take the burden off my shoulders. Her words dripped with concern, but her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. I sat down slowly, the folder heavy in my lap. I flipped through page after page, lines of text that blurred together. I saw places for my signature, for initials, for witness marks. Each one seemed to strip another piece of my independence. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay composed. Zach leaned against the arm of the chair, watching me with an expression that carried no warmth. For a moment I searched his eyes, begging silently for a hint of the boy I once knew, the one who used to rest his head on my shoulder after nightmares. Instead, I found a man who had chosen his path. Brooke sat across from me, legs crossed, speaking gently as though I were a patient child. She said that sometimes older adults needed a little help, that it was nothing to be ashamed of, that families were meant to support one another. Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin they were building for me. I closed the folder and placed it on the table. My hands shook not from age, but from fury I dared not show. I asked quietly what would happen if I did not sign. Brooke's smile faltered for half a second before she recovered. She said it would be fine, but things might become more complicated. She assured me she and Zach only wanted what was best. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Zach finally broke it. His voice was low, steady, without emotion. He said, "Mom, it is for your own good." His eyes met mine then, not with love, not with hesitation, but with cold certainty. My chest clenched as the truth settled fully in. My son was no longer on my side. He had aligned himself with her ambitions, with her lies. The home I had paid for, the life I had built, even my dignity, were all being packaged neatly into papers and signatures. I rose from the couch, the room tilting slightly under my feet, and excused myself. I carried my bag down the hall into my bedroom. The bed was made, the pillow placed precisely where the officers had lifted it. The rug had been vacuumed, the surfaces dusted. It looked tidy, perfect, and foreign. I stood in the doorway staring at the space as if it belonged to someone else. Behind me, I could hear Brooke laughing softly with Zach in the kitchen, her voice lilting like music, his answering tone calm and steady. My knees threatened to buckle, but I sat on the edge of the bed and steadied my breath. In that moment, I understood that I had returned not to my home, but to a stage where they had written the script for me. They wanted me quiet, compliant, erased one line at a time. I pressed my hands together, whispering silently the promise I had made to myself in that cell. They would not take everything I had built. They would not bury me under their signatures and smiles. I would not give them that victory. The night air seeped in through the cracks of the window, carrying the faint smell of rain. I lay back on the bed, my body weary, but my mind restless. Sleep did not come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Zach's expressionless face, his words echoing in my ears. "Mom, it is for your own good." The sound of it settled like ice in my veins. I sat in the stillness of my room long after their voices faded down the hall. The papers on the table kept replaying in my mind the neat lines waiting for my signature, the false promises of protection. My son's words had left a chill in me that no blanket could warm. For your own good. I knew then that the only way to hold on to myself was to remember exactly who I was and what I had built. My life had not been handed to me. I had worked for every piece of it. I had walked into Jefferson High as a young teacher with nerves in my stomach and chalk dust on my fingers. For 20 years, I stood in front of those classrooms guiding teenagers who thought they knew everything and showing them that they still had room to grow. There were nights I graded papers until my eyes blurred, weekends spent writing lessons that might reach just one more struggling student. I never thought of it as a burden. It was my calling. In 2012, 2 years after I retired, the district honored me with an award for educational excellence. They handed me a plaque on a stage under bright lights, and for once I felt seen for the years of sacrifice. That same year, my textbook on critical reading was published and adopted in several states. The royalties trickled in at first, then grew steady. It was never about the money, but it gave me the freedom to secure the future I had dreamed of. Over decades, I saved carefully, setting aside every extra check, every bonus, every royalty payment. I bought my home in Richmond outright, a 2-story house with blue shutters and a front porch where I once sat with Zach as a child reading stories to him while fireflies blinked in the yard. Years later, I purchased a small cabin outside Charlottesville, tucked away among tall trees, a place I told myself would be my retreat one day when the city grew too loud. I opened retirement accounts invested in modest stocks and never touched the money I did not need. Over time, it added up. Between the properties, the funds, the royalties from my book, and the pension I earned, my net worth had quietly grown to nearly $12.5 million. I never flaunted it, never lived lavishly. I wore the same shoes until they wore thin, planted my own vegetables in the garden, and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper. My wealth was not in the things I bought, but in the security I created. And now I could see it clearly. Brooke and Zach had studied my caution, my routines, my privacy. They had waited until the years had softened me until I trusted them with my space. Then they had struck. It was not about the bag under my pillow or the false statements she had written. It was about dismantling everything I had built, turning my life's work into a prize for themselves. I remembered the day I first brought Zach to Jefferson High. He was only 7, wide-eyed, clinging to my hand as I walked him down the hallway past the lockers. He looked up at me as if I could protect him from anything. That boy would have been horrified at the man who now stood silently as his wife performed her little play for the police. I rubbed my temples, the ache in my head pounding harder with each memory. The realization hurt more than the cell, more than the handcuffs. They wanted not only my money, but the erasure of me, the rewriting of my life into something broken and untrustworthy. If they succeeded, my name, my legacy, my work would all vanish under the shadow of their lies. The award from 2012 sat on the dresser, its gold plate still gleaming faintly in the lamplight. I ran my fingers over the engraved letters, remembering the applause, the pride I once felt. I would not let Brooke and Zach twist my story into one of shame. My legacy was not paranoia or instability. It was classrooms full of students who had gone on to college, to careers, to families of their own. It was the book that still helped teachers guide their students. It was the home and the garden and the cabin places I had created with my own labor. The thought of them signing my name away in neat ink filled me with a fire I had not felt in years. They thought they could strip me of my dignity quietly, that I would fold under the weight of age and humiliation. But they had underestimated the strength of a woman who had stood for decades in front of classrooms, who had faced down defiance and disrespect and kept going. I closed my eyes and let the memories flood through me. The laughter of students in the hallways, the scent of chalk on my clothes, the night Zach and I had spent reading on the porch, the moment I first saw the cabin and knew it would be mine. These were mine to keep no matter what papers they tried to shove in front of me. When I opened my eyes again, the fire had steadied into something colder, sharper. I understood now that Brooke and Zach were not trying to care for me. They were trying to erase me, and if I did nothing, they would succeed. The clock ticked softly on the wall. In the silence of that house, I made myself another vow. My life's work was not theirs to take. My legacy was not theirs to rewrite. I would guard it with everything I had left, because the truth was no longer hidden. Brooke and Zach were not only after my home or my accounts. They wanted to strip away the life I had built with my own hands, and I would not let them succeed. I waited until the house was quiet before I moved. Brooke's laughter had faded into the bedroom down the hall, Zach's footsteps heavier as he climbed the stairs. I sat still for a long while, listening until the creaks of the house settled back into silence. Then I slipped on my slippers and walked to the garage. The smell of dust and oil hit me as I opened the door. My husband's old metal cabinet stood in the corner, rust edging the sides, the lock stiff with years of disuse. I knelt my knees aching against the concrete floor and pulled at the drawer. It resisted at first as though guarding secrets too old to release, but finally it gave way with a screech. Inside lay stacks of files, manila folders stained with time receipts from decades ago, and photographs tucked between papers. My fingers moved slowly, careful not to scatter anything. At the very back behind the property deeds and tax forms was a folder marked in black ink, faded but still clear. Backup. I opened it and froze. There, clipped neatly together, was a power of attorney drafted in 2010. The name printed in the line of designation was not Zach Hayes. It was Dylan Carter. I sat back on my heels, my breath catching in my throat. Dylan, my nephew, my sister's boy. He had lived with me for 2 years after the accident that took her life, no older than 11 at the time. I remembered him sitting at the kitchen counter while I made pancakes, his small voice asking if I thought his mom could still see him from heaven. I remembered how he had clung to me the first night, refusing to sleep alone. I had nearly forgotten about this document drawn up in the years when I still believed Zach was too young and impulsive to handle serious responsibilities. I had chosen Dylan because even as a boy, he had a steadiness to him, a carefulness that belied his age. And then life carried him away to college, to work to a career in logistics down in Raleigh. We had spoken less as the years passed, but the bond had never broken completely. I traced his name on the page with my finger, the ink slightly raised from the pen strokes. My heart lifted in my chest for the first time in days. Zach and Brooke thought they had cornered me, but they had not counted on this. I leaned back against the cold cabinet and closed my eyes. Memories of Dylan filled me sweet and steady. The summer afternoons when he helped me plant tomatoes in the backyard, his hands covered in dirt, but his grin wide. The way he once built a small birdhouse in shop class and proudly hung it on my porch, saying it was for me because I loved to watch the cardinals. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen lighting my face in the dim garage. A notification blinked at the top, a text I had not noticed before. "Aunt Maggie, are you okay?" It had been sent 2 days ago, the morning after my arrest. My throat tightened, my eyes stinging with sudden tears. I had not replied. I had been too consumed with shock, too overwhelmed by betrayal. But now that message felt like a rope tossed across a raging river. He knew something was wrong. He had reached out, and I had ignored it. I pressed the phone to my chest and let the hope wash through me. I was not completely alone. The night air drifted into the garage through the cracked door, cool against my skin. I placed the documents carefully back into the folder and tucked it under my arm. Walking back into the house, I paused at the threshold, listening again for footsteps. Nothing. The house was still. I returned to my room, slid the folder beneath the bottom drawer of my dresser, and sat on the bed. The papers Brooke had pressed on me earlier still lay on the nightstand, waiting for my signature. I stared at them, then at Dylan's name glowing in my memory, and I knew what I had to do. Brooke and Zach wanted me erased, my identity, rewritten as fragile and unstable. But the truth sat quietly in my hands, steady and undeniable. I had chosen someone else long ago, someone who might still stand by me. I lay back on the bed, the sound of the house faint around me, and clutched the phone one last time. The unanswered message burned at the top of the screen, small but powerful. I whispered into the darkness, not to Zach or Brooke, not even to myself, but to the memory of the boy who once looked at me with trust in his eyes. You were my choice for a reason. For the first time since the night of my birthday, I felt something more than despair. I felt the smallest flicker of hope. The morning after I found Dylan's name, I dressed carefully and slipped out of the house before Zach and Brooke stirred. The sky was pale with the first light, the streets of Richmond quiet, except for the rumble of delivery trucks. I carried the folder tucked inside my bag, its weight pressing against me like both burden and shield. Janet Lee greeted me at the downtown branch office of Piedmont Trust Bank. She had managed my accounts for years, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that never wavered. When I stepped into her office, she looked up and studied me for a moment, as if she could see the storm I carried inside. I told her I wanted to review my beneficiaries. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled as I placed the list in front of her. She glanced at the paper, her brow lifting when she noticed the names missing. Zachary Hayes, Brooke Hayes, both gone. In their place were distant relatives, 2 old colleagues, and charities I trusted. She asked if I was certain. I said I was. She nodded, once entered the changes into her system, and then met my eyes. She said she would flag any suspicious activity moving forward. Silent alerts, no outward signs. She promised to watch. I thanked her and left the bank with my heart thudding in my chest. One door had been locked. That afternoon, I met with Thomas Maroy, the estate attorney who had helped me years ago with a licensing dispute. His office smelled of paper and lemon-polished shelves stacked high with law books. He remembered me, asked about my retirement, then noticed the tightness in my shoulders. I told him I needed my power of attorney reviewed and updated. I slid the old document across the desk, Dylan's name clear at the top. We spent nearly 2 hours revising the language. I told him I wanted strict clauses, specific safeguards, limitations that would keep anyone from stepping into my life without my consent. He suggested adding conditions that required my presence before a judge for any conservatorship. I agreed. When we were done, he placed the fresh documents into a fireproof envelope, locking one copy in his safe and handing me another. As I left his office, I felt lighter. Another door locked. In the days that followed, I contacted Hazel Monroe, a former student who had become a freelance financial analyst. She had once thanked me for encouraging her to pursue economics when others doubted her. When I explained that I needed quiet eyes on my accounts, she agreed without hesitation. She called me back 2 nights later. Her voice was calm but urgent. Someone had tried to log into 2 of my accounts. Both attempts came from a device registered to Brightwave Marketing, the agency Brooke managed. Hazel promised to monitor everything closely and send me regular updates. While I moved these pieces quietly into place, Brooke pressed harder at home. One evening, she brought a new stack of documents into the kitchen, her heels clicking on the tile. She set them in front of me while Zach poured himself a drink, pretending disinterest. Brooke smiled, saying she had rewritten the previous forms, fixing errors, simplifying language, making it easier for me to sign. Her voice was honey, but her eyes glittered with impatience. I took the papers, slowly flipping through them while nodding as if I were grateful. Inside my chest, fury burned hot, but I forced a smile. I told her I appreciated her efforts, that I only needed time to read everything carefully. She leaned closer, her perfume sharp, and reminded me that sometimes waiting only made things more complicated. Zach's voice drifted across the kitchen, low and firm. He said it would be better if I signed soon, that it was just practical. He did not look at me as he said it. I felt the sting of his betrayal all over again, but I kept my face calm. I told them I would review everything overnight. Brooke pressed her lips together but nodded. When they left the room, I slid the stack into a folder I kept hidden under a cushion in my bedroom chair. Later that night, I photographed each page and sent them to Hazel and Thomas. The language was careful but dangerous, granting Zach broad rights over my finances and medical care. I sat in the dark afterward, the glow of my phone fading, and breathed slowly. I thought of the locks clicking into place one by one. Janet had secured the accounts. Thomas had sealed the legal safeguards. Hazel had caught the fingerprints of Brooke's ambition on my accounts. Each step closed a door they thought stood open. The house was silent except for the creak of the old floorboards. I could hear Brooke laughing softly in the bedroom, Zach's low voice following. I closed my eyes and let their sounds fade into the distance. They believed I was cornered. They believed I would fold just as I had so many times before. But they could not see the walls I was building, quiet and strong, each door closing softly behind me. By the time I drifted into restless sleep, I knew the truth. They were playing a game of control, but I was not unarmed. Every signature they waited for would never come. Every trap they set was already being dismantled. I kept my silence, and with that silence, I locked every door from the inside. The idea came to me late one night as I sat alone in my bedroom, the papers Brooke had handed me stacked neatly on the dresser. My eyes kept returning to the pillow where the police had found that bag placed so carefully as if a stage prop. I knew Brooke would not stop. She rehearsed every move, every gasp, every smile. If I wanted to fight them, I needed proof stronger than my word. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk where I kept old teaching supplies. Beneath notebooks and pens, I found the small black GoPro I had used years ago to record lessons for online students. I charged it overnight, the faint red light glowing in the dark like a warning. The next morning I tested it, making sure the lens was clear, the battery solid. It felt strange to hold like a weapon disguised as something harmless. When Zach and Brooke left for errands, I placed the camera on the top shelf of my bookcase, angled so it faced the bed and dresser. The lens was no bigger than a fingernail, easy to forget once the room settled back into its quiet self. I turned it on and let it record. Then I left for the garden, pruning roses and pulling weeds, my eyes flicking often toward the window upstairs. The first afternoon passed with nothing. Hours of empty footage, the bed unruffled, the door closed. But on Thursday, while I stood in the yard watering the tomatoes, I saw movement in my window. Brooke slipped into my bedroom. She moved quickly, practiced. Her hand went straight to the pillow, lifting it, sliding her fingers underneath. Then she crossed to the closet, pulling hangers aside, scanning the corners. She checked under the rug, opened the drawers, then placed everything neatly back in place. I watched from the yard, my grip on the hose tightening until water sprayed across my shoes. That night, I retrieved the camera, my hands shaking as I plugged it into the laptop. The video loaded slowly, the progress bar crawling. And then there she was. Brooke, her face calm, her hands deliberate, moving through my things like she had every right. She even smiled once, a small smirk, when she closed the closet door. I played it again and again, memorizing every movement, every glance. 2 days later, the camera caught Zach. He entered while I was at the grocery store. He did not bother with the bed. Instead, he went straight to the dresser, opened the folder Brooke had pushed on me, and took photos with his phone. He moved methodically, page by page, his face blank but focused. When he was done, he slid the papers back as if untouched and left. I sat at my desk late that evening, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting off my glasses. My stomach churned as I watched my own son handling documents meant to strip me of everything I had built. The betrayal cut deeper each time I replayed the clip. Yet beneath the pain was something stronger. Proof. I transferred the files to a secure drive, labeling each by date and time. Then I uploaded them to a private cloud account Dylan had once helped me set up, the password still etched in my memory. Finally, I forwarded copies to Hazel and to Thomas Maroy. Both replied within hours. Hazel sent a single line, "We have them now." Thomas wrote that the evidence was clear and could not be ignored if things escalated. I leaned back in my chair, the faint hum of the computer filling the silence. My hands trembled, but not from fear. It was something closer to relief, the feeling of standing on solid ground after weeks of sinking. They thought they were invisible, that I was too old, too frail, too trusting to notice. They did not know the walls had eyes. The next morning, Brooke poured me coffee, her voice bright as she asked if I had slept well. Zach glanced at me briefly, then looked away. I stirred cream into the cup, steadying my hand, and said nothing. My silence must have pleased them. They believed it meant surrender, but the truth was different. Every smile they gave me, every gentle word, every feigned gesture of care was now caught in contrast with the images I held in secret. I no longer had to guess at their intentions. I had seen them. As I washed the cup in the sink, I caught my reflection in the window. My face looked tired. The lines deepened, but my eyes were clear. Behind me, Brooke hummed softly, setting plates on the counter, while Zach scrolled on his phone. They moved with the confidence of people who believed they were winning. They did not know that the ground beneath them had already begun to crack. I dried the cup and placed it on the shelf, my fingers steady. Then I turned and walked calmly back to my room, the secret safe on drives and in files they could not touch. For the first time since the night of my arrest, I felt a surge of power. Not loud, not obvious, but quiet and sharp, hidden like the lens that had caught them. They had no idea they had already been caught. Brooke began to tighten her grip in small but relentless ways. Breakfast was no longer mine to prepare. She would sweep into the kitchen before I even came down the stairs, laying out oatmeal, fruit, or dry toast, and tell me she wanted me to eat something healthy. At lunch, she would set a salad in front of me watching until I took the first bite. Even dinner became another performance, her voice bright as she reminded me to finish what was on my plate. Zach would sit beside her, nodding his eyes on his phone, repeating the same line whenever I resisted. "It is good for you, Mom." The control spread beyond meals. Brooke insisted on organizing my appointments, suggesting new doctors I had never heard of. She kept a calendar pinned on the fridge with bright marker notes telling me when I should rest, when I should go for walks, even when I should call friends. I noticed how the friends' names disappeared week by week until only her reminders remained. One afternoon, she appeared in the living room with a glossy brochure in her hand. The cover showed smiling seniors on a lawn, their hands raised in a yoga class. She set it gently on the table in front of me and said she had found a wonderful retirement community just outside Charlottesville. She called it peaceful, safe, and full of people my age. Her smile was wide, her voice careful, but the intent behind her eyes was sharp. I pushed the brochure aside without a word. Zach leaned forward in his chair, his tone even. He said it was only an option, that I should not be upset, that maybe it would give me comfort. The words sounded like a verdict already written. The pressure did not end there. One warm evening, Brooke brought a folder outside where I was sitting on the porch. She set the papers on the table beside my tea and leaned close, her perfume strong in the air. She told me again how important it was to sign, how it would protect me, how it would relieve my worries. Her hand rested lightly on my shoulder, her nails pressing just enough to feel like a reminder. What she did not see was Clara Bennett across the hedge. Clara had lived next door for 30 years, a woman with sharp eyes and a memory that never faltered. She was watering her begonias, her gaze drifting over as Brooke pressed the pen into my hand. I held it but did not move, letting the moment stretch. Clara tilted her head slightly, watching. I told Brooke I would think about it. She sighed, pulling the papers back, but not before Clara saw the bold print at the top. Power of attorney. Clara's eyes lingered a second longer, then she bent to adjust her hose. I knew she had noticed. Later that night, as I stood at the sink washing a single glass, I saw Clara through the window closing her blinds. Our eyes met briefly, and though no words passed between us, I felt a flicker of connection. Someone else had seen. The days grew heavier. Brooke hovered in doorways, her arms crossed, her smile fixed like porcelain. Zach repeated his lines with the calmness of someone convinced he was doing the right thing. I felt my voice shrinking, my choices slipping away. Even the garden felt less like mine as Brooke moved among the roses, pruning shears in hand, as though she had planted them herself. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone speaking in a hushed tone about timelines and transfers. When she saw me, she raised her voice asking about groceries, but the words she had spoken before still hung in the air. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of their laughter drifting down the hall. Each chuckle was a reminder of the net tightening around me. They were weaving my silence into their story, preparing the stage where I would have no part but as the frail, unstable mother who needed saving. Yet I was not entirely alone anymore. Clara's steady eyes, the tilt of her head, the way she lingered as Brooke pressed me had planted a seed of reassurance in me. She had noticed. She would remember. I sat in my room late one evening, the folder of secret evidence hidden safe, and whispered to myself that I would endure. They thought they were erasing me, stripping away my voice. But Clara had seen, and now their careful play no longer unfolded unseen. The thought of escape grew louder in my mind each day until finally I pulled my old keys from the dresser and drove west. The road wound past fields and hills, carrying me farther from Richmond and the house that had become a cage. After nearly 2 hours, I turned onto a narrow lane lined with sycamores and saw it. The cabin I had bought in 1987, forgotten by almost everyone, stood waiting at the edge of the woods. The roof sagged on one side, shingles curling. Vines crept across the porch, and the door leaned slightly on its hinges. But when I stepped out of the car and breathed in the smell of pine and damp earth, my chest loosened. No one stood behind me here, no one watching, no one pressing papers into my hands. The silence was mine. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust coated the floor, and sunlight streamed through cracks in the roof. A family of squirrels had claimed the attic, their scurrying faint above me. Still, the walls stood firm, the fireplace unbroken, the windows intact though clouded. I touched the wooden banister rough and solid under my palm and felt something stir inside me. This place was worn forgotten, but not destroyed. The next day, I called a local contractor from Charlottesville, a man named Eric, who came with his brother and a truck full of tools. They shook my hand firmly and promised to start with the roof. I watched them climb ladders and strip away the rotten shingles, their movement sure and practiced. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, but it was not harsh. It was alive, the sound of renewal. As the days passed, the cabin slowly changed. New cedar shingles gleamed in the sunlight. Fresh wiring brought light to the rooms. The porch steps were replaced sturdy beneath my feet. I swept the floors myself, wiped the dust from the windows, and laid blankets across the old chairs. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a claim. Piece by piece, the cabin became mine again. One afternoon, while waiting for the electricians to finish, I drove into Charlottesville for supplies. At the hardware store, a woman handed me a flyer while I stood in line. It was for the Elder Justice Project, an organization that helped older adults facing financial exploitation. I almost folded it into my purse without thought, but the words caught me. Financial abuse, power of attorney fraud. My hands tightened on the paper. Later that week, I met her in person. Her name was Connie Brooks, a coordinator for the project. She invited me into a small office tucked between a law clinic and a bookstore. The walls were lined with pamphlets, but her eyes were warm and steady. I told her enough of my story for her to understand. She listened without interruption, her hands folded on the desk. When I finished, she leaned forward. She told me I was not alone, that many families hid betrayals behind the word protection. She spoke of clients who had lost their homes, their savings, their dignity, not because strangers had stolen from them, but because their own children had. Her voice was steady, not bitter, but full of quiet strength. "You are not alone," she said, "and you are not powerless." Those words settled in me like a seed. I left the office with a list of resources numbers of advocates and lawyers, but more importantly, I left with a sense that I was part of something larger. My pain was not an isolated wound. Others had faced this battle and some had won. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the air was cool and carried the scent of sawdust. The porch light clicked on with a new switch, steady and bright. I stood there staring at the glow against the trees and felt the weight in my chest lift. I set a small table near the fireplace and placed my old journal on it, opening to a blank page. I wrote about the first day I walked into Jefferson High, about the students I taught, about Dylan helping me plant tomatoes, about Clara's eyes watching from her garden. I wrote about Brooke's smirk as she searched my drawers, Zach's silence as the police carried me away. And then I wrote about this place, this cabin, the scent of cedar, the hammering of nails, the sound of freedom returning. The words spilled faster than my hand could keep up, as if my story had been waiting for this space to be told. By the time I closed the journal, the fire was crackling low, and the stars had filled the window above the porch. I knew then that the cabin was not only a retreat, it was a beginning. A place where I could rebuild not just walls and roof, but the parts of myself they had tried to erase. I curled beneath a quilt on the couch, listening to the steady sound of the forest outside, and felt the fire's warmth seep into my bones. For the first time since my birthday, I did not fall asleep in fear. I fell asleep in resolve. The decision was clear. I would start again from here, and from this cabin I would build a new life that no one could take from me. The night of the meeting at La Verona felt heavier than any courtroom. I dressed with intention a navy blouse and pearl earrings that had sat untouched for years. My attorney, Thomas Maroy, walked beside me through the warm glow of the restaurant, past the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversations. A private room waited at the back, its table already set for 4. I sat with my back to the wall, my hands folded in my lap, the folder of documents resting on the table between us. At exactly 5 o'clock, Zach and Brooke arrived. Brooke wore a fitted dress in deep red, her hair pinned perfectly, her smile rehearsed. Zach trailed behind her, his face expressionless, his shoulders tight. They hesitated when they saw me. Then Brooke recovered quickly, leaning in to kiss the air near my cheek. Zach only nodded. Thomas began without preamble. His voice was firm, deliberate, every word striking the polished wood of the table like a gavel. He announced that all of my assets, totaling $12.5 million, had been transferred into an irrevocable trust. He explained that the trust was airtight, that no family member could claim any portion unless named explicitly. Their names were not on it. The color drained from Brooke's face. She shifted in her chair, eyes darting to Zach, then back to me. Zach's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Thomas opened a second folder and slid a laptop across the table. The screen lit with the first video. Brooke entered my bedroom, her hand slipping under the pillow, her movements careful and deliberate. The silence in the room grew sharp. Brooke gasped as if seeing it for the first time, then stammered that it was taken out of context. The second clip played. Zach in my room photographing documents one by one, his face calm, his hands steady. He stared at the table now, his glass untouched, his throat working as he swallowed hard. Brooke turned on him, then her voice cracking. She accused him of pushing her into it, of making her believe it was necessary. Her words spilled fast, sharp, desperate. Zach remained silent, his shoulders sinking under the weight of proof. I watched them both, their masks slipping, their alliance cracking in real time. For months they had whispered in corners, laughed in halls, smiled as they handed me papers. Now the evidence lay open, undeniable, and the power they thought they held was gone. I spoke then, my voice steady. I told them they had betrayed me, but they had not erased me. I told them my legacy was more than money, more than property. It was every year I spent teaching every student I guided, every piece of myself I poured into building a life with meaning. I told them they could not take it because I had already given it to people who deserved it. Brooke's hand trembled as she reached for her glass. Zach finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine, but there was nothing left in them. No apology, no recognition, only the dull weight of defeat. I stood, the folder still on the table, my pearls catching the dim light. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. I said the words I had waited to say since the night of my birthday. You betrayed me, but you cannot erase the life I built. I choose who inherits my name, and it will not be you. For a moment, the only sound was the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen beyond the door. Brooke's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Zach's silence was louder than her panic, his stillness cutting sharper than her protests. Thomas gathered the folders, calmly slipping the documents back into his case. He thanked them for their time, his tone professional, final. I placed my chair neatly against the table and walked out of the room. As I stepped into the main dining hall, the warmth of the restaurant washed over me. The scent of garlic and basil, the murmur of strangers' conversations, the laughter from another table. Life carried on indifferent to the storm that had just broken in that private room. I pushed open the door to the street, the cool Richmond air brushing against my face. Behind me, the alliance of my son and his wife was splintering, their careful facade collapsing under the weight of their own betrayal. For the first time in months, I walked into the night without fear. The balance had shifted. The power was mine again. Back at the cabin, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I opened the windows wide and let the smell of pine rush in, chasing away the lingering weight of Richmond. My hands moved quickly those next weeks, not from panic, but from purpose. With Thomas guiding me, the trust was more than protection now. It became a vessel for something greater. I called it the Second Foundation, a program that would provide grants and shelter for women over 60 who had lost homes, pensions, or security to the same kind of betrayal I had endured. I met with Connie Brooks again this time, with papers spread across her desk instead of just stories. She helped me draft the Mission Connect with local nonprofits and file the initial documents with the state. Her eyes shone when she read the outline. She said there were more women than I could imagine who would stand taller knowing this existed. I thought of my students, of the women I had mentored quietly over the years, and I knew this was the shape my legacy was meant to take. The cabin transformed alongside me. Fresh paint brightened the walls, the porch rails gleamed with new wood, and the fireplace roared each night with steady flames. It was no longer just a refuge. It was a base of renewal. One evening I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, Dylan stood there, older than I remembered, his shoulders broader, his eyes hesitant. He held a grocery bag with bread, cheese, and apples. He stepped inside slowly, as if unsure he was welcome. We sat at the small kitchen table, steam rising from mugs of tea. He cleared his throat, his voice low, raw. He said he had left Zach and Brooke's house weeks earlier. He told me the lies had worn too thin, that Brooke's control had become suffocating, that even Zach seemed smaller, hunched under the weight of his own choices. Dylan admitted he had stayed quiet too long, that his silence had felt like betrayal of its own. My chest tightened, but I did not lash out. I told him I did not need an apology. What I needed was honesty. He nodded, his eyes steady now, and said he wanted no part of their schemes, no share of the fortune. He only wanted to remember me as the woman who had raised him when his world first collapsed. That night after he left, I added his name quietly to the list of beneficiaries in my journal. Not because he asked, but because I wanted to honor the thread of trust that still remained between us. Meanwhile, Clara Bennett was not idle. At the next neighborhood association meeting, she stood in front of the crowd and spoke plainly. She described what she had witnessed in my yard, how Brooke had pressed a pen into my hand, how the papers bore words no neighbor should ever coerce another to sign. The room fell silent as she spoke. By the end, murmurs of disapproval rippled through the community. Richmond was not kind to those who preyed on their elders. I heard later that Brooke's business began losing clients, that her once polished image cracked under the pressure of whispers and questions. Zach stayed in the shadows, silent as ever, but silence offered no shield now. I spent my days at the cabin writing letters to the first women we would help. One was a widow whose son had drained her pension under the guise of managing it. Another was a retired nurse whose daughter forced her to sell the home she had lived in for 40 years. Each story echoed my own, yet each woman carried her pain with quiet dignity. I wanted the second foundation to be more than money. I wanted it to be proof that betrayal did not end a life. The nights grew calmer. Dylan visited often, sometimes helping repair shelves, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes sitting in silence beside the fire. He never pressed, never asked for forgiveness. He only stayed, and that was enough. One evening, as the fire burned low, I closed my eyes and listened to the stillness. The betrayal of Zach and Brooke still ached like a scar, but it no longer defined me. What defined me now was the laughter of students from years ago, the rustle of pine outside the cabin, the steady presence of allies like Clara, Connie, Hazel, and Dylan. I realized then that my victory was not only survival, it was transformation. The fortune I had built was no longer bait for greed, but a foundation for others to stand on. The cabin walls seemed to glow with new warmth as I whispered to myself the truth I had come to live. I had not only protected my life, I had turned the ashes of betrayal into something lasting, something larger than me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my years not as a burden, but as a crown I had chosen to wear. Spring arrived gently in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the kind of spring that did not announce itself with sudden heat, but with soft winds and green buds on the branches. The cabin was finally complete. The cedar shingles glowed warm in the sunlight, the porch steps held steady under my feet, and the windows sparkled clear after years of neglect. I woke each morning to birdsong instead of tense whispers, to the smell of pine instead of Brooke's perfume. I spent my days in simple rhythms. I brewed coffee on the stove, wrote in my journal by the fire, and walked along the narrow trails that wound through the woods. Sometimes Dylan joined me, his pace unhurried, his words sparse but thoughtful. He carried guilt like a heavy coat, but I reminded him that silence broken was still courage. We did not speak much of Zach and Brooke anymore. Their names felt distant like storms that had passed. The cabin became not just a refuge, but a symbol of what I had reclaimed. Each nail hammered, each board replaced, each coat of paint was part of a declaration. I was not erased. I was still here. The fortune they had tried to seize had been reshaped into the second foundation, already sending out its first grants. Letters arrived from women I had never met. A retired librarian who could finally keep her home. a widow who could pay for health care without fear of losing her dignity. Their words filled me with a pride that no award or plaque had ever given me. Sometimes at night I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders listening to the owls call across the trees. I thought of the girl I had once been eager to teach, eager to build. I thought of the woman sitting in a jail cell on her 70th birthday, humiliated, abandoned. And then I thought of who I had become stronger, not because I had chosen this battle, but because I had refused to surrender. Zach and Brooke had moved away from Richmond. I heard whispers from Clara that they sold their house quickly, that Brooke's business lost clients after her name spread through the neighborhood. Their alliance fractured under the weight of their own schemes. They had tried to build their future on my ruin, and instead it crumbled beneath them. I no longer needed revenge. Their downfall was their own creation. One afternoon, Dylan arrived with groceries just as he had on that first night, but this time he also carried a box of tools. He repaired the gate that leaned at the edge of the driveway, then sat with me by the fire. He spoke about new plans about starting fresh in North Carolina, away from the shadow of Zach's choices. Before he left, I told him I had added his name to the trust. His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like the boy who once clung to me after his mother's death. He whispered thank you, his voice breaking, and I knew the circle of trust had been restored in some small way. As April unfolded, the hillsides turned green and the dogwoods bloomed white and pink along the roads. I drove into town less often, preferring the stillness of the woods. When I did visit, I stopped at the general store where the clerk always asked how I was doing, her voice warm. Connie called once a week, updating me on the progress of the foundation. Hazel sent encrypted reports, brief but reassuring, confirming that every account remained safe. Clara waved from her garden when I drove through Richmond, her eyes steady as always. I realized then that my strength had never been only my own. It came from these people who stood quietly beside me, witnesses, allies, and friends. My story was not just survival. It was community rebuilt in unexpected places. On the first warm evening of May, I sat at the porch table with my journal. The fireflies began to flicker in the grass, the sky glowing deep blue. I wrote the words that had carried me through. Peace is not revenge. Peace is reclaiming your own life. I closed the journal and let the quiet surround me. My hands no longer shook. My heart no longer raced with fear. The cabin stood firm, the trust secured, the foundation alive. My life belonged to me again. If you have listened to my story, perhaps you have seen pieces of your own reflected in it. Maybe you have known betrayal or silence or the weight of being underestimated. If so, I hope my story reminds you that peace is possible, not by erasing what has been done to you, but by reclaiming what is still yours. Tell me what part of this journey touched you most. Share your own story if you are ready. We are not alone, and our voices are stronger together. Stay here with me because there are more stories yet to be told.